Okay, let me share the screen. Let's go here, go share. Bang. Okay, presentation's up. Um,
Okay, we ready?
Yep.
Yep, we're
Okay,
live.
okay, we're ready. Good afternoon from the States. For some, it's already Wednesday morning. Some, it's late Tuesday evening. So thank you for staying up late with us. Uh, and we're excited to have a good conversation today on group audits. I wanted to thank Glenn, the task force, the staff team for putting together a very clear paper. The real goal today is to get some guidance and feedback on the 4 questions laid out of the issues paper, as well as to get any further input from the board on issues that based upon the reading of the comment letters that the task force may have missed or interpreted in ways that you may not have seen. So I think we could, to use our time most effectively, go straight to Len. And thank you, Len and Jasper and team, for Dan and for everyone for putting together a very good paper.
Thank you, Tom. And I guess, Michelle, you have the control of the slides, right?
Yes, Michelle is control.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, and especially thanks to the board. I know we approved the exposure draft back in March, and a very challenging situation. It was the first time we had virtual meetings. So thank you for the board. And I also want to put on a public record that this is a last task force get together for Bob and for Rich. Bob has been with the working group since 2016. It's been a long time, and over the years, Bob has been very supportive in his previous role, and also the role of the AICPA provided a lot of good comments. So I want to acknowledge Bob publicly for his contribution, and also Rich. Rich had the experience of ISA 540, the difficult standards, and also brought in Dan and Jasper along the way, and Jamie as well. So, and also Rich brought in a lot of good experience being a group auditor himself, and also EQR in the process. So I just want to make sure that they are acknowledged for the work they've done in the ISA 600 project. But also want to thank the QN task force chairs, because this is a project that linked to a number of requirements and application materials in the QM project. So since the issuance of the exposure draft, the QM chairs, Julie, Enron, and Lynn have been very supportive in terms of getting me involved leading up to the approval of the September QM standards approval. So thank you for their support. And lastly, of course, the staff and Dan and Jasper, as you can tell, and Tom mentioned that the quality of the issues paper and the heat map you're going to see later. Dan and Jasper, just doing a tremendous job, and of course the rest of the task force members. We had several late night task force meeting leading up to today's session. So thanks to my task force member. Also welcoming Eric to the task force. The Canadians are very interested in the group project based on the type of engagement you see in Canada. So very happy to have Eric's involvement going forward. As Tom mentioned, the objective for today's session, moving to a next slide, uh, clearly we want board's input on some of the initial views and recommendation of the 600 task force related to some key things identified in the exposure draft. There were a number of comments, but we are bringing four specific topics for you for reactions. Of course, we'll provide some high-level overview of the comments we heard, but it's important because we are meeting as a task force. I guess with the second week of January, if I'm not mistaken, with the calendar. So we need input from the board members on those four key areas, so we can start working on the drafting and also making some further recommendations based on what we heard from you today. So I'm not going to do a lot of talking. I'll probably just summarize some of the comments and I'd like to go around the table, seek your views. Next slide, please. So we received 82 comment letters, and they are actually long letters. They are very thoughtful, high quality comment letters. Since the exposure of the ED, we had a number of outreach and webinars, uh, engaging the stakeholders to help them prepare uh, their common letter process. There were some key messages, key changes we thought might be helpful having individual outreach and also public webinars. And task force members and staff and I spent a lot of time and also a lot of support from, for example, Enron and Roger, Renee, and Sylvia, Lynn. We had webinars in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Hong Kong. Josephine have done a number of outreach, and Jamie as well. And also we had another session with IAASB as well, leading up to their common letter process. So not surprisingly, actually surprisingly, we actually received all of monitoring group letters early. IAASB was almost 1 month early, and IFIA a week early. IAIS insurance regulator provided their comments 3 weeks or 2 weeks in advance of the closing day. So a lot of outreach we've done leading up to the ED with IAASB, IFIA, and other monitoring group members were actually very useful because they gave us a lot of comments to consider, and they give us the letters way ahead of the deadline, so give us something to work on. As well as other regulators and public sectors and practitioners, there were a lot of good comments. Next slide, please. So this is a heat map that Dan and Jasper created. So we had a number of questions in the exposure draft. And so this is a bird's eye view of the key questions, 12 questions. And we use the traffic light to demonstrate that in terms of support, concerns, and significant issues identified. So you can see that, not surprisingly, that risk-based approach clearly is a concern of a number of stakeholders. But on the positive side, you do see a lot of green lights as well. The scalability, professional skepticism, common control, the one area component, performance materiality. Those are we receive a lot of positive comments on those areas, so we're pretty happy. Of course, the yellow area, there's still some challenges, especially from practitioners and also some regulators on those specific areas. So we're going to spend some time focusing on the 4 area with the black borders. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 areas we're going to be focusing on today. A number of them, not surprisingly, we heard them through our board deliberations leading up to the approval of the EDs. And these are the 4 key areas the task force feel that we need significant amount of time to work through. And before the next meeting, March meeting, the task force will meet at least twice and to go through some of these the issues and the comments we hear from you today. So moving forward to the next slide. I appreciate all the board members and TA probably spend all the time reading the agenda paper 4. So I'm not going to spend all the time going through each paragraph in that agenda paper. So, but in summary, maybe before we open up for inputs and comments, let me just summarize some of the key comments we heard and some of the initial task force recommendation. So in this area, the first section on scope and applicability. So the comments in this area predominantly, I think the commenters asking for additional clarity that's needed on the definition of group financial statement, and particularly the description of the consolidation process. A lot of stakeholders also expressed their confusion with respect to the aggregation of the financial information of branches and divisions, particularly paragraph A17 of the exposure draft, with respect to the application of the ED 600 to the financial statement of a single legal entity. Some commenters suggested allowing for use of a professional judgment in determining whether 600 ED applies to a very simple group structure or internally structured business units such as branches and divisions. And lastly, it was also noted that paragraph 2 of the extent 600 is considered useful in dealing with certain scenarios that are not addressed directly by 600. As you recall, extent 600 also has certain language such as use of the work of other auditors for physical inventory observation. So that paragraph has been deleted in the ED. But some commenters feel that that paragraph was still useful and calling for restating that paragraph. So in terms of the task force proposals for this section, on the definition of the group financial statements, the initial view of the task force is that the reference to consolidation process continue to be appropriate in the definition of the group financial statements. So the task force believes that the respondent comments can be addressed through revision to paragraph 11 of ED 600. As you recall, ED 600 paragraph 11 explain what consolidation process means in applying ISA 600. So we feel that the issues we heard can be addressed through revision to paragraph 11, also related to application material from A16 through A18. And also by more direct linking the definition of group financial statement definition, paragraph 9K, to the description of the consolidation process. So task force also discussed that clarifying consolidation process is using ISA 600ED has a different meaning from the term consolidations that's using the financial reporting framework, such as IFRS 10. So by clarifying the difference might help address some of the comments we heard. Then, and lastly, the task force discussed a number of options and approach for addressing the comments we heard regarding aggregation of the financial information of branches and divisions. Those options are discussing paragraph 21 of the issues paper. So I don't want to read them one by one. There are 3 options in paragraph 21 of the issues paper. So based on the initial discussion, the task force views that the best approach may be to scope in all instances of entities with branches or divisions as explained in paragraph 23 of the issues paper. And the task force considered that the comments from respondent regarding the extent 600 paragraph 2, including suggestions to retain the paragraph in the revised standards. In the discussion, the task force was in the view that clear link to the paragraph A1 of 220 should be provided. As you know that when we issued ISA 600ED, ISA 220 was not finalized. So with the finalization of ISA 220, that language in A1 220 addresses some of the concerns regarding the extent paragraph 2 in 600. So with that summary, I'll turn back to you, Tom. Maybe people can open up for discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Okay, so we're taking comments on questions 1A, B, and C, right? And this is paragraphs 11 through 31 of the issues paper. Is that correct, Len?
Yeah, that's correct. 11 to 31.
Okay. Isabel.
Yes, hello everybody and good evening. First of all, I want to thank the task force for the impressive work that has been performed in such a short timing, and also for having been able to prepare a summary and propose responses to the various comments they received. More particularly, and I want to note that I really appreciated the fact that agenda item 4 really captures adequately the comments that have been raised. However, I strongly disagree with the solution that is proposed to solve the question around the scope of ISA 600, and that is reflected in question 1B. And I have no comments on what is proposed on 1A and 1C, so let's focus on 1B. And when I say I disagree, it's not just me, but it's the unanimous outcome of the discussions I had with many practitioners from CNCC and CSOEC, including small practitioners and also partners from bigger firms. And so I'm sorry to say, but my comments are of a fatal flaw nature. So let's go to the point. The proposal submitted to the IAASB today is to include within the scope of ISA 600 the audit of entities with branches or divisions, which would be considered as a consequence as groups for the purpose of audit. So first of all, let me explain where I come from. In France, as in many European countries, and I know the situation is also similar in many French-speaking African countries, all entities are required to prepare standalone financial statements. And then in addition to that, when they control other entities, when the group is over a certain threshold, they are in addition required to prepare consolidated financial statements. And so when an auditor is appointed, the auditor audits the standalone financial statements, and if consolidated financial statements are prepared, they also audit the consolidated financial statements. And normally, the standalone financial statements are prepared in accordance with local GAAP, and subsidiaries, if any, are accounted for at cost in the standalone financial statements. So, of course, I have no doubt that the audit of consolidated financial statements have to apply ISA 600. But my points relate to the audit of standalone entity. I mean single legal entity. Should a single legal entity be considered as a group for audit purpose only due to the fact that this entity has branches or divisions? So branches may have a legal definition. So I will focus my comments on the concept of divisions. And all the practitioners I spoke to have all their audit clients organized with several divisions, and even very small clients. What is a division? It's a split for accounting purpose of the activities of a legal entity, leading to having subledger for each activity. And there are many reasons why an entity will create divisions. And these divisions, we can label them also as accounting segments, because that's what it is. So an entity may create a division to follow up the operation of an activity, for example, by product, by activity, by geography. An entity may also split its activities by management line. Each manager is responsible for the turnover, expenses, margins of a division. It's under its responsibility. An entity may also split its activity in various subledgers due to tax rules. Entities may maintain one subledger by tax rate. And they also can maintain various subledgers due to funding sources. Some activities may be regulated or financed by a region, by a state, by a donor. And for all these reasons, a single legal entity may decide to create divisions and follow segments within its accounting. So let me give you a simple example. That's the example of the coffee shop next door. And as you know, we have many coffee shops next door in France. Most of the coffee shops next door sell both coffee and tobacco. In the same shop, it's the same personnel, but for trading tobacco is regulated by the state. So then they need to report that activity separately. So within their accounting, they have a subledger for coffee and a subledger for tobacco. As the coffee shop next door become a group, this would be a nonsense. There is no aggregation risk. Everything is booked in the same general ledger, even if there are several subledgers. And there is a single local location and no component auditor. And the same thinking would apply also to standalone entities with 2 lines of products or 2 plants or whatever. So, of course, there are other situations where I do consider that having a branch is sufficient to qualify an entity as a group. And this would be the case, for example, of the situations where a bank has a branch in a foreign country, preparing accounts under a different accounting framework and audited by a component auditor. But if you go back to the coffee shop next door, I understand that some people believe that it's not a big deal, as applying ISA 600 revised would lead to a situation where the audit of the coffee shop next door would not at the end be different from what it is today. But the auditor would have to go through a 100-page or so standard, and then later on, when the methodologies will have been developed, fill all the supporting questionnaires and enablers to demonstrate the compliance with the standard, to be able not to change anything to the audit approach. I think that by expanding the scope of group audits to the audit of single legal entities with divisions, we are not covering appropriately the real risks of a group audit, and that we will lead many auditors to focus on form over substance on performing the audit work. And auditors will spend their time documenting compliance with the standard instead of performing the procedures and the risks identified, and this would create a quality risk. So what is the real risk to be dealt with in a group audit? I can think to 2 of them, but there may be more. First of all, there's the aggregation risk. When branches or divisions have different accounting system or apply a different accounting framework or are managed with issues of currency conversions to deal with, or consolidation, additional consolidation entries are booked in the consolidation. I can also see a risk when we involve a component auditor, whether this component auditor belongs or not to the same network as the auditor of the group. But there may be some other risks. But just that the fact that the entity has decided to split in business in division is not for me sufficient to conclude that this risk exists. So to solve this issue, I would propose that we have an entrance gate to ISA 600 similar to the one that we have to ISA 610. As a reminder, ISA 610 applies when the auditor plans to use the work of the internal audit or when the auditor plans to have the internal auditor performing some direct assistance. So we could have something like ISA 600 apply, and that could be when the auditor has identified an aggregation risk and or when the auditor has identified the need to involve the component auditor, and maybe many more. But if we don't build such an entrance gate to the standard, I believe that ISA 600 would apply to 99% of the audit of standalone entity. And this audit of standalone entity do not need to qualify as a group. So thank you, and sorry, it was quite long, but I wanted to explain because I understand that some people may have a different accounting regulation, so maybe we can understand that differently, but for us, it's a very strong point. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. That's a very clear explanation. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And very hard to go after Isabel on that particular performance. Very well articulated, Isabel. Len, again, congratulations to the working group. Again, I think you've got very useful feedback and you've put a very, very clear and concise paper together. So congratulations on that. My concern's similar to Isabel, although my solution's probably a little bit different. So I'll concentrate on, again, what I see as the consolidation process and what I see as the risk. And I do see the risk as an aggregation risk, and the risk you're trying to deal with is an aggregation risk. So my comments are probably more back into A, because I was not looking at changing the scope as much as Isabel was looking at changing the scope. But I do feel uncomfortable with what we've defined as a consolidation process, which I think is very much similar to where Isabel is taking you with limiting the scope. But my preference would be, and I know that you've got a discussion. For me, the discussion still does not lead me away to thinking that we've got more of an aggregation risk and an aggregation process there than a consolidation risk and consolidation process. You know, I think of it from a training perspective, and we have people who are trained on trained a lot on consolidations and consolidation processes. And I know it's in different frameworks, and I know we can be consistent with our framework, but the more that we can be consistent across effectively our reporting frameworks and lend to that, I think is important. So I have a similar concern with Isabel. I have a suggested solution. Mine is, and I know that you've discussed it and considered it, but I would encourage you to keep on looking at aggregation risk and aggregation process as distinct from trying to define a consolidation process as something different than what we've had. So that's where I would place the major attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. Fiona?
Thank you. And like everyone else has said, I'll echo the comments, Len, on the amazing work that the task force has done. I certainly recall when we were dealing with the 315 responses, I don't know that I could have done that process virtually. So congratulations to all of you. I really enjoyed the paper, and I've found myself saying a lot, I agree, yep, that makes sense, I agree. So I don't have a lot of substantive comments to make today, but I will just make one minor comment just on part B. So different to Roger and Isabel, I don't actually agree with them. I agree with where the task force got to. The one comment I was going to make, and it will probably come up, or will come up again when we talk about LCE later in the week, just in paragraph 24, where you talk about allowing professional judgment as to whether or not this would be used for an LCE entity. I don't agree with that, and I'm not even convinced that we should be allowing LCE to be using, or to, if there's a group from an LCE perspective, we should be using this. So So that's something that I disagree with. I think if we're going to allow it, it should be really clear from the scope, because I think otherwise we will get inconsistent application, which is not helpful from a group audit perspective either. And that's the only comment I have. I'm supportive of all the other comments you've made in these paragraphs. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Sachika?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you very much for Len, your great presentation. It is very helpful for me to, digest the overall, reaction from the letters. And I have very similar point with Isabel and Roger with regard to B. I don't agree with the task force proposal to apply 600 to all instances of entities with branches of division. I agree that there are circumstances where the entity with branches or division should be within the scope of the group audit, but I believe it is only under certain limited or exceptional circumstances, because if the standard is to be revised to apply all instances of entities with branches or division, it will expand the application of the standard to a lot of entities, which we currently do not apply group audit. And I am not sure if that is beneficial without, taking careful consideration on what we are trying to aim by applying either 600. I think it's very similar point with Isabel, but for example, I'm very concerned about the unintended consequences that it will create an additional issue of scalability of ISAs. Because I think it's likely that a less complex entity which only operates a very simple business and has a very simple financial reporting process has some branches of division. I think ISA 600 should applicable to entities with branches of division only under certain circumstances. For example, when the branches of division are significant to the entity and it's located overseas, which make it difficult to audit without the involvement of component auditors. So I think to avoid the confusion about applicability, I think clarification is needed, of course, on the limited or exceptional circumstances, but not to simply expand application. That's my point. Thank you.
Keep going. For some reason now that your picture keeps on moving around, so I'm looking to unmute myself, and I'm like, I don't know where to unmute.
Sorry about that.
No, it's not me. It's not you. It's my picture. Sachika, thank you very much. We have a lot of comments on question part 1B, not surprising, and certainly defining what the threshold should be for inclusion is probably one of the more challenging elements of this standard. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom, and a very good morning from Singapore. Thank you, Len and Task Force. I really enjoy reading the paper. I think it's really well thought through, very well structured. Fantastic work there. So my comments are, I guess like Fiona, as I was reading through, I agree with many of the Task Force thought process with a little bit of, I guess, caution here and there. So in response to your question, first of all, 1A, I agree, especially paragraph 19. I think just making it very explicitly clear that consolidation process in our ED is different from how people read consolidation in applicable financial reporting framework. I think that will go some way in helping the confusion. To B, I agree with the concern expressed by many of our colleagues, especially the very well-articulated reason given by Isabel. Although that did not lead me to outright, I guess, reject the proposal by the task force, I would cautiously support the proposed alternative. But I think, as pointed out by the task force in the second bullet point of paragraph 23, audit effort may be simplified in circumstances, I think in those that were explained by Isabel, Sachiko, and so on. And I really would like to see how we can significantly strengthen the guidance on how audit efforts can be simplified, so that you do not end up in a situation where the practitioners need to invest, a significant amount of time trying to just navigate 600 and explain why so many different things do not apply in their circumstances. So it doesn't sound like I'm saying yes or no. It's because I do feel that it may have unintended consequences, and I think we need to just manage it very carefully if we were to proceed with this. To see, I would support it as well. I prefer repeating it and also referencing it to 220. So just to be clear that this is into 220, and this is how the linkage is made. On top of what you have in question A to C, I also want to point out one other thing, if it's okay. Paragraph 30, where we talk about the equity accounted investment. So there's a suggestion that we may have guidance, for example, including the ability to use audit evidence as audit evidence, the audited financial statements of an equity method investee. I'm not entirely sure about that. I thought it might be subject to abuse. And I'm not sure if allowing audited financial statements to be used as audit evidence is always appropriate. Why can't you allow that for subsidiary, for example, of a similar financial significance? I think the risk-based approach that's been required by our ED 600 should be applied rather than bluntly pointing out that they can use audited financial statements. I think that would be a step back in terms of quality from my perspective, so I'll be quite careful about that. That'll be all my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Chun-Li. Len, should we continue to keep going through the round? We have a number of hands up. Maybe do you think you want to get 2 more or 3 more and pause, or do you want to hear everyone straight through?
Well, yeah, thank you, Tom. Maybe I can come in here just in case I have repeated comments. Isabel, thank you very much for your comments, and just putting the public record that Isabel and I spoke for an hour with Jasper yesterday or this morning, my time, or last night. So thank you for raising our comments publicly, and so we went through different considerations. Of course, the task force also need to meet as a group based on your suggestions. Also, others has raised Roger and Sashiko's on 1B. I think when we spoke, some of the ideas, whether this is a scalability issue, whether it can be addressed through additional guidance and implementation materials. But your suggestion is, focus on aggregation risk, which we still need to be careful or think about, whether that might have unintended consequences. So I just want to, give some flavor in terms of conversation I had with Isabel a few hours ago. And Roger, the word aggregation process, that was the original recommendation by the task force leading up to the ED. And at that time, the board did not like that expression and asked us to try to align with the financial reporting framework terminology. So the task force originally had used the word expression aggregation process, but we'll take down a look. And Fiona, thank you for your support, and your reference to paragraph 24. This is the discussion, I guess, will continue in the LCE. Whether in your view, group audit shouldn't apply to LCE. Then listen to some of the argument. Will be interesting to hear from other board members as well, in terms of where this branch divisions, the single entity, I think a single legal entity and the less complex entity, are two different things. You could have a single legal entity that's quite complex as well. Just imagine in North America that there might be a single legal entity with a single entity bank, with multiple branches, gas stations, supermarket. It could be single entity, but with multiple branches and divisions. So those are more complex, so I wouldn't look at as a single legal entity versus a multiple legal entity as a debate. It's more of a less complex, more complex, but we take note of the comments and Ching-Wei, thank you for the cautionary reminder in terms of as we proceed forward in terms of things we need to watch out. On the equity investee, I think that came through ITC as well. That's one area that might link to access to information, right? Access might be that, and at the end of the day, the auditors still had to go through 315, as you said, but also need to evaluate the audit evidence as well. I think this might link to the ISA 500 project as well in terms of how you evaluate the audit evidence, and also in consideration of the access issue. So we'll look into that. Well, thank you very much for the comments. Clearly, 1B, receiving a lot of varying views and input, but I think that's exactly what we need as a task force. We need to continue to pursue a solution to address that. So I'll conclude here and maybe listen to more input and views from other board members.
Hi.
Tommy's back.
I'm back. Sorry about that. For some reason, my connection got lost for a minute. So I'm sorry I missed a little bit of your response. Okay, Julie.
Thank you. And thank you, Len, to you and your task force for the hard work. Great paper. I appreciate how hard it is to do some of these things virtually, having just gone through the QM standards. I was with Fiona as I was reading through the paper. I think largely I agreed with the direction the task force was heading. On question 1A, I do agree that the task force should retain the reference to consolidation process. I think in the respondent feedback we got there's a call for some clarity there, some clarification that can be made. And I think that's an appropriate response, but I'm still in agreement with the task force's proposal that you retain that reference to consolidation process. That really ties in then to my response for 1B. I think that if there's a consolidation process, which means you're auditing group financial statements, it could very well mean that there's branches and divisions that fall into that consolidation process. And if so, I think you're in ISA 600. And so I didn't have an issue with the task force's proposal to include branches or divisions if, first of all, there's a consolidation process by which those are included. Because I think that's the first step you have to overcome before you decide whether you're in 600 or not. I do think there's a potential scalability question, particularly if maybe there aren't component auditors included in that audit, and therefore that might be a case where the task force or someone else could provide some real practical guidance on how to deal with that, maybe from a more simplicity point of view. But I don't think that means you're out of 600. And there was an application material paragraph in the ED that might have confused things a little bit. I think it was A17 where there was a potential carve out, and I would suggest to the task force you remove that because I think it complicated it a little bit. And then on 1C, I had no issues with the task force's proposal there. I was in agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Sue?
Thanks. So possibly similar to Julie, and it was interesting hearing her discussion about the requirement for the consolidation, bringing the scope into then the consideration of the branches, because I had a very similar concern to what Isabel had described about the bringing branches and other divisions into the scope of 600. So I wonder whether there's something that can be explored and perhaps clarified around that whole scoping piece. It was also interesting hearing Len's reflection on the fact that you, at the other end of the scale, you can have very large, very complex single entities. So I feel there's definitely some clarification there. And on question 1C, I was also comfortable with bringing that paragraph back in again. Thanks.
Thank you. So, Kai Morton.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Len and Task Force, for the great work being done to collaborate all the views from the exposure. Similar to others reading through the papers, I felt that I agreed with a lot of the things that the Task Force had proposed. I do have some concerns on 1B, as others have explained here already, that it could extend the scope too far of who should be using the ISO 600. But I also like Julie, the explanation she had by somewhat linking it closer to the consolidation process could help on that issue. So other than that, I'm fine with a lot of the proposals from the task force. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai.
Yeah, good evening, and Len, thank you very much for the work. I appreciate it very much what you have done with the task force. I'm very similar in my comments with Julie, Fiona, and Sue. The general direction of the paper I very much support and agree to little a with the task force proposals on the definitions of group financial statements. I also agree with little b with the task force proposal to include at entities with branches or divisions involving a consolidation process. And Len, I also agree with little c. Thanks.
Thank you. Imran?
Yes. Hi, good evening. It's midnight in Johannesburg. I have written to Len and the task force to share my comments, but really so that I could keep them brief here. But I wanted to really appreciate how excellently well the issues paper was drafted. I thought that the issues paper was particularly fantastic because it kept the issues simple. It described the issues well, and it really did a great job in sharing what the implications of the various alternatives were. This really made it very easy, therefore, to, in respect of question 1, to support the task force's proposals in respect of 1A, 1B, and 1C. In particular, on their paragraph 23, I thought that the suggestion worked really well. And I think maybe where there is a gap to close is a little bit more context in respect of the introduction to paragraph 23, which may be helpful to those who currently are skeptical about the strength of this proposal, and also about the proposal in paragraph 24, which I'm specifically in agreement of. Tom, I think also it's important at the start of this conversation around feedback on the ED to really acknowledge publicly the support that the ED has received globally. By my count, all the questions discussed in this issues paper have received over 80% of support. And it's really wonderful and a testament to the quality of standard setting at our board that an ED can receive, an ED of this complexity can receive this level of support from such a wide range of stakeholders. And I think the entire board, but particularly the task force, needs to be credited for that and for our excellent due process that resulted in an exposure draft like this, and the ability for the board to have this conversation so soon after the closing date has passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and hello, everyone. Same as Fiona and Julie, I also enjoyed reading the papers and didn't really find any major concerns or issues. I was very happy with the ED when we approved that, the concepts, and all the evolution from the extent. I'm very supportive actually on the comments and proposals that the task force has prepared and has included in the papers. I had to admit though that probably I keep hearing questions, especially for the very small groups, like one holding, one trading company, one payroll company, that they consolidate at the end. The question in terms of what's really the applicability of 600 in those small groups. I think Chongwei mentioned that, yes, there's got to be some kind of guidance that emphasize what really it's the minimum that should be done, because those small groups are really non-complex, very simple to audit, same auditors, same accounting department, same location, same systems, and people are not really quite clear what needs to be done or documented to be in compliance with 600. But besides that, I guess comments in general are very supportive, and I want to express my thank you and also the support to the task force. Thanks.
Thank you. Lynn?
Good evening, everybody, or good morning, and thank you for the floor. I generally don't have a lot of comments on the proposals that the task force has put in front of us, but there are a couple on question 1. I accept this as relitigation, but I do think the comment letters have questioned the consolidation process, and I'm with Roger. I prefer aggregation process, and to avoid the confusion with taking you to the to the accounting standards and their definition of consolidation, because they are different. So if we are going to maintain the use of consolidation, I do think it's important to draw that distinction between the accounting standards and this particular definition. On B, reading the paper, I was supportive, but listening to the discussion, people are bringing entities into the scope of this ED that I didn't think were in the scope of this ED. So obviously there needs to be some clarity around the application material, and maybe some material, some implementation material that makes clear the scoping issue. And on C, I agree, but wonder if there's an opportunity. We use physical attendance and visits in 220. I wondered if there was an opportunity here to use some of the lessons we've learned over the last couple of years about virtual auditing, and I just put that on the table as something to consider. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the task force.
Thank you, Lynn. Yosh, you've been very patient. You're the last hand up. I start calling you.
Don't worry. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for the LAN and the task force detailed analyzing and compiling many responses. I think this paper becomes so understandable. Thank you very much. I have just one comment about the small a. As mentioned, Julie, Sue, Fiona, and so on, we as a regulator support retaining the term of consolidation process in the definition of group financial statements. However, sufficient explanation is needed that the consolidation process within ISA 600 is a broader concept than the general concept of consolidation in financial reporting, as mentioned by others. In addition, I would like to place the definitions of both the group financial statements and the consolidation process in close proximity, along with the application materials to improve readability and understandability. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Yosh. So Len, the good thing is that a lot of the comments were extremely supportive of the task force's positions on 8A and C particularly. Some comments as it relates to terminology, consolidation versus aggregation. B obviously is drawing the most attention, and in your comments midway through, even when I dropped off too, I know you continued to say it seems like more work needs to be drawn to that question, so you're not unintentionally drawing people into the standard, which I don't think was the intent. But this is a little bit of an art in drafting here, so to get the threshold right and not to allow too much judgment, which is not the intent here. I think some of the support that we've received, particularly from regulators and users and other stakeholders, could dissipate if we make it too open to loopholes. It was my interpretation of what I'm hearing and what I've read so far. So I think I hope that's a fair summary of what we've heard on question one. But I turn it back to you and to what your take is.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think your summary is reflective of the discussion so far. Yeah, clearly we probably need to go back and look at 1B. But I just want to know that the concept of division branches is not new. It's in the X10 standard. It's in paragraph A2 of the X10 ISA 600. But we do take note that perhaps additional clarity in scoping the entry point to the standards. We need to do some work as a task force for further discussion. But also realizing there was a lot of support as well by the board member and also in the common letter process. So we'll take note of those comments specifically to 1B, and also consider it's already been mentioned in the X10 600, and also need to find out how practitioners are doing today when the concept of division and branches are already in the X10 standards. So there's clearly more work to do. But I want to thank everybody for the comments. Very helpful. The task force clearly have work ahead of us on 1B. So Tom, if that's okay, maybe we can move to the next section.
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you. So moving forward one slide to section 2. If you could on the slides. This area, I'm sorry, section 2. I'll go back one more. So this section deal with a definition of component. So in summary, there was a lot of support for the revised definition of a component, with respondents specifically noting that it provides necessary flexibility to plan and perform audits of group of different sizes and complexities. So the main comments we heard is particularly on the practical challenge side of using this definition. When the auditor's view of components differs from a management's view. For example, a couple of things, availability or accessibility of the financial information at the components that's identified by the group engagement team might be different from the management. And also the identification of the component management for the purpose of management inquiries and management representation. So there was some concern where once you identify a component, it may not be a component management. So how do you deal with that practically? There was some recommendation that the auditor should first understand management's view of the business prior to determining the components for the purpose of testing. So respondents also note that it's important of the understanding of the group and its structure and financial reporting process required by ISO 315 as the foundation for the group engagement team's determination of the components. So a greater linkage to 315, we hear that for this section. So the task force proposals in summary is we do appreciate the overwhelming support of the revised definition, but of course there's additional clarification and guidance probably needed. The task force view is that some of the comments and concerns on the revised definition of the components arose because the reference to auditor view versus management view were not sufficiently clear. Perhaps that's responsibility of the task force. Maybe when we explained it in our explanatory memorandum, also in the webinar, maybe we won't clearly explain what we mean management view versus auditor's view. So it was never intended that the auditor would take the radical different approach or different view of the group structure for the purpose of audit. So several important points that may need to be re-emphasized in the finalized standards, that including that in practice, many group engagement teams consider group structure as a starting point. I think that needs to be emphasized in the revised standards. The revised standards also should emphasize that management itself may organize its financial reporting in a manner that's different from the legal or operating structure of the group. So that management starting point, the management view of the group, and also their operating structure should be the starting point. That's because their view might be different from a legal structure. And the auditor will come in, may base that determination of the components on the way the management has structured the financial reporting process. So we have some language in there, maybe need to be repurposed to emphasize that message. If you look at paragraph A54 of the ED 600, that can explain that the management's view versus the auditor's view and how management structure the financial reporting process. So that paragraph probably need to be elevated or repurposed, relocated to the front of the standards. Also, based on understanding of the group and its financial reporting process, the group engagement team consider other factors in determining the approach of the group audit, such as the ability to perform procedures centrally or in the presence of the shared service center. If you look at the agenda paper, paragraph 43, we kind of explain some of the task force initial thinking in that area. But clearly, task force also need to further discuss whether more is needed regarding the documentation of the engagement teams, determination of the components, as well as maybe there's a need to communicate those in charge of governance in terms of a group engagement teams, determination of the components. There was one monitoring group members had a suggestion that documentation is needed in the group auditor's file. So with that summary, Tom, I'll turn back to you and open up the floor for comments. And this is focused on paragraph 36 to 47.
Okay, thank you, Len. Fiona, and then Julie.
Thanks, Len. I'm supportive of what you've suggested here for 2A and 2B. No issues with relocation. I'm assuming you'll do it in line with, I think there's some comments in your paper that talk about the clarification that you were wanting to do. So assuming you're doing that clarification, no issues at all. So very supportive of those suggestions. Thank you.
Julie.
Thank you. And Len, I'm in the same place. I'm supportive of what you have here in question 2A, 2B. I definitely know what the intention of the board and the task force was when we had the words auditor's view and management's view. And if those were misinterpreted, we can probably fix that up. But definitely the direction where you're heading. And also, I would support maintaining some flexibility for the group audit team to determine components. I think that that's still an important principle to maintain. So I would like to see that continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Coyote?
Thank you, Tom. Again, very briefly, full support, Lan. Agree with little a, with the providing additional clarity as suggested by the task force, and also support for little b. I also agree moving paragraph A 54 of ED 600 to reflect application material to the definition of component. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. And the support the direction on the determination of components. The language that you've got in the issues paper, actually, I thought was clearer. So there might be things that you can transport over there. One question that came up from the outreach was around in the components, the need for those charged with governance, and how that applies in the situations where perhaps we're talking about a shared service centre. So that might be something to reflect on at the practical end, but generally supportive of the direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Tom Martin?
Thank you. And just to say that I'm supportive of the direction that the task force is heading on this. I think that it reflects where we should go. So very supportive of where the task force is heading on these two areas.
Chun-Wei?
Thank you. Supportive of both A and B as well. Just a minor comment on paragraph 44, where we say presumption is that group engagement team or auditor will be able to identify relevant management responsible or internal control. So I guess based on the feedback that we've already received, question is on what basis are we making assumption that presumptions, or are we really saying that the availability of relevant management responsible for the underlying financial information and internal control should be a consideration? Also supportive of, so paragraph 45, I believe that the documentation requirement is already quite clear and appropriate. And I agree that greater clarity may be needed or helpful in respect to communication of those charged with governance. So I want to also put my support on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Roger?
Yes, I'm too very supportive. I think a very clear outline in the issues paper as to how to address it, and I agree with Sue that you've probably got some of the words that can be used. Supportive of also the comment that Julie made of maintaining some auditor discretion after careful consideration of those areas. I would support that.
Thanks, Roger. Isabel?
Yes, that will be much shorter than the previous questions. I support the proposals of the task force for both 2A and 2B.
Thank you. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. And also, Len, very supportive on 2A and 2B, and for the auditors to keep the flexibility of defining the components. That will really help in practice dealing with the different types of groups. Thanks.
Okay, thank you all for comments. So Len, the task force received general support for its directions with some helpful suggestions around provided further clarity on questions 2A and 2B. Question 3, I'm sure will generate some more discussion. What I suggest is, Len, you set up question 3. Then
Sure.
everyone, we could break for 10 minutes as sort of a nice halfway point, and everyone could rehydrate to get ready to go for question 3, and then we'll come back with a break, and we'll deal with that. And the questions, as I said, there actually are 6 questions, not 4. We're doing them in 5 rounds, though.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you for all the feedback, very helpful feedback and support in section 2. So in terms of section 3, moving forward one slide. So this is the area focused on risk-based approach, and as you can recall from the heat map, this is one area we received a significant number of comments asking for clarifications. So in summary, respondents' comments in this area is on balance, there was a lot of support for the principle of risk-based approach, and the overall premise is that the group engagement team takes overall responsibility, and also the responsibility for the risk assessment procedures and work performed to support the group audit opinion. There are some key matters raised. The importance of the involvement of the component auditors. I think the respondents challenge that the presumption, the ISA 600 ED, that the group engagement team should directly perform or take over much of the components auditors' work. That was not the intent. So what component auditors are doing under the extant ISA 600 is actually the intention is the same work effort, but maybe people feel there's a presumption that the ED explained the opposite. So the respondent highlight that the important role of the component auditors play in the group audit. It's the importance of the role they do, continuous involvement in a group audit setting. There was a comment about removal of the concept of significant component. We had that discussion leading up to the ED. Respondents indicate that in some group audits, the focus on significant component may continue to be appropriate and useful. So those are the 2 key areas we heard in this section. In terms of proposal, in summary, as regarding significant component, the task force recognized that the extant 600 concept of a significant component is viewed in practice as a backstop for making sure that sufficient work is performed in a group audit. So the removal of the concept in ED 600 in combination with the enhanced responsibility for the group engagement team and the perception of a preference for procedure to be performed centrally may cause some concern. So we do recognize how that was expressed in ED and also in the explanatory memorandum. But on balance, the task force is a view that there's not sufficient support for retaining the concept of significant component. So therefore discuss other way to address the comments and concerns in that area. So the task force, we did discuss developing a more robust way for addressing the special consideration in identifying, assessing, and responding to risks of a materials misstatement based on existing requirement in the revised ISO 315 and ISA 330. On the involvement of the component auditors, to address the comments received, the task force is considering clarify several areas in the ED 600, including when to involve component auditors and recognize the importance role of the component auditors, strong linkage to ISA 220 and ISA 315, more clearly representing the requirement and application materials when to involve a component auditor. Also, the process to determine whether to involve component auditors. in terms of responding to assess risk, including the scope of work assigned to component auditors, factoring the concept of centralized activities and commonality of controls. There was a number of discussions in terms of clarity, application material to be considered. For example, clarify the section on responding to assess risk, including the scope of work assigned to component auditors. Also clarifying the scoping options, all the procedures on entire financial information may be needed for certain component. So those are, in summary, task force recommendation and initial thinking, and we'll come back after a break to see comments from the board.
Thank you, Len, for setting that up. We're going to take a break right now. It's 5:25 p.m. my time. I say that I'll give you to 5:40, which is a 15-minute break, but so people have a chance to get refreshments. But if you want to raise your hands, then I get before you leave, that would be great. So I get a sense of how many people want to come in. And then we'll see you in 15 minutes. Good. Thank you for all the input for the first couple rounds. Thank you. See you shortly. So as they say, about a minute left, 1 minute warning. Okay, let's, Len, are you ready? Got the thumbs up.
Ready.
So we're going to address the risk-based approach. I'm gonna ask Sachiko to lead us off. So Sachiko, please respond to question 3A and 3B.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much, Len, for your presentation. For A, I agree this is the most important area that we need to address, and I agree that the task force's idea of creating a framework on how to apply the risk-based approach is very helpful because many concerns are expressed from the respondents that the ED did not contain sufficient guidance to operationalize a risk-based approach in practice. But at this point, I have to say that I am not in agreement with removing the concept of significant components in proposed ISO 600, because as you explained, some respondents asked that we should clarify that focus on financially significant components is still appropriate in some audit, of course, if it is appropriate in the circumstances, and without the clarification, there is a risk of potentially reducing audit quality in group audit. However, I do not see how the alternatives suggested will address the concern raised. And for B, similar to A, at this moment, I'm not in agreement. I agree with the task force that involvement of component auditor is critical for many group audit engagement, and this message should be clarified. However, a relating issue raised by some respondents that I think needs to be addressed is the responsibility of the component auditor itself. I think the respondents asked we should clarify that the component auditors are responsible for their exercising professional skepticism and obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence as directed and supervised by the group engagement team. And some respondents provided some proposals to address the issue, but it is not clear to me on what the task force's proposal is with respect to the component auditor's responsibilities, which I think is essential when considering their involvement. Perhaps it may be right now, I just read the overall direction only, so I need to read the revised draft, but right now I cannot say I am in agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachiko. Roger?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Sorry, getting around to. I wasn't expecting to be second. Look, I'm supportive. I agree that the significant component is one of the biggest issues, and lots of feedback there. I'm supportive of where the task force has landed, Len. I think you're trying to put a lot of safeguards in there, and we need to see how 315 will work in practice. So I think that's important. Excuse me. I like the idea of the stand back, and I think that would be part of the consideration of the stand back to make sure that there's appropriate assessment of financially significant components. So I like that idea, and I like the idea of the framework. So I am expecting there will be sufficient safeguards in place without losing the risk-based approach. So it'll come down to the wording, but I think you do have the concepts there that are supportive in that regard. Again, on B, very supportive of where you're going. I think the component auditor involvement is critical. A little bit like Sashiko, though, we'll have to see how the words work out. So yeah, so the concept is right, and it's a matter of, you know, whether we can get the words to best address. So, but supportive of where you're going in that particular area as well.
Thank you, Roger. Fiona?
Thank you. I'm supportive of where you've got. So question part A, I think I don't mind removing the old concept of significant component. I think the key point that you draw out, which is the critical part to keep, is the concept of financial significance of the component. So I really like where the task force has got to with that. And then on part B of the question, just a couple of minor points, I think, which link into paragraph 95, that first bullet point there. I don't disagree with what you've said around, you know, the starting point being, you know, thinking about the ROMs from a group perspective. I do think it's important, and this may just be a nuance, that that's not solely the responsibility of the group engagement team to identify those ROMs. Your component auditors are still involved, and that might be obvious. I apologise if that is the case. And I just wondered whether or not the nuance for me is that it's the group engagement team taking ultimate responsibility, because I still would expect that the partner in charge at the component level would still have responsibility as well. So we just want to make sure that we're not letting them abdicate their responsibility from a component level, but they're not particularly large points, and I'm sure the task force has already got those in mind, but I'm supportive, Len. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Julie.
Thank you. And Len, on 3A, I'm also supportive of the removal of significant components, so where the task force is proposing. I do agree with you. I think there is concern that that safety net may have been removed. And so I really like the task force's suggestion that there's probably a framework that needs to be thought about as to how you would evaluate whether or not you have sufficient and appropriate audit evidence at the end of the day. And so I think maybe there's something in the PCOB standards or somewhere else where we might be able to pull some factors from that would help in preparing that framework. There are a couple of suggestions in paragraph, I think it's 83 in your paper, around the linkages to ISO 315 revised. I totally support that strengthening those linkages makes sense. I would just say there were a couple in there where we might introduce new requirements. And so I maybe to borrow your red, green, what is it, red, yellow, green colors, maybe it's a yellow, and maybe just proceed with caution on a couple of those requirements, because I do think that there's a fine balance between what the group engagement team needs to determine and what the component auditors need to determine. So I noticed that there. On 3B, again, supportive, although I guess in principle, I didn't think we were suggesting anything different in the ED about the involvement of component auditors. It's always been options for group teams to use component auditors. I thought we'd ended up in the same place, but fully agree that when I read the respondents' comments, they felt something different. So agree that the task force needs to probably revise some of the wording there to take out any impression that we are de-emphasizing the role of component auditors. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Yosh?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much. And I have just one comment about this A. I agree with the risk-based approach in group audit, but based on the feedback comments, there might be a concern about indicators of the procedures which have been minimally performed for components. I think such concern is warranting comment on the confusion in practice due to the loss of clear indication that has existed now. The proposal of removing such concepts should be addressed with careful consideration, please. About B, The proactive involvement of component auditors in group audit is an important factor in the performance and quality management of group audit. So especially, I support more clearly establishing the degree and the manner of component auditor involvement at the stage of risk assessment in the requirements and application materials. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you. Chun-Wei.
Thank you, Tom. So Len, I have some comments sort of scattered around this section, which I will not go through on the call, but I will send through my comments offline. But overall supportive of where the task force is heading. I think in terms of clearly there's discomfort with the removal of significant component based on the respondents' feedback. But I think the way we present the alternative approach sounds sensible, and we'll be keen to hear the feedback from those respondents again based on those direction. But I'm supportive. B as well, I'm supportive. Just have a comment on paragraph 90. So first of all, I agree we should be addressing the missing sufficient appropriate piece, and I think that will drive consideration of the extent to which the engagement team should include a component auditor. The later part of that paragraph talks about how component auditors may have greater experience, more in-depth knowledge of components and environment. And I agree with clarifying that. It doesn't, to me, tie so much to the sufficient appropriate resource bit, but I think it ties more to the fact that the ED only talks about competence and capabilities of component auditors, rather than collectively the engagement team as a whole, as required by 220. So I wonder if we should consider addressing the issue that way instead, i.e. just making it clear that you should be looking at competence and capabilities of the engagement team collectively as required by 220, and then as applied to 600, this is how it may play out. So that will be perhaps similar direction, but maybe a slightly different angle for consideration, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Chun-Wei. Kaiui?
Thank you, Tom. I have one comment to A and a couple of suggestions for little B. I start with little A. Len, I believe that one monitoring group member and some other important commentators, that there may be suggested that there may be circumstances when the concept of a significant component and a full scope audit of the financial information might be needed. I would encourage the task force to consider what these circumstances might be before the retention of these concepts in their entirety. Then I have a comment for little B. Len, I'm in general agreement with the task force proposal with respect to the involvement of component auditors, but suggest that the task force also consider when component auditors may need to be involved in risk assessment and not just focus on responses to risk. Then secondly, that the task force recognize that geographic location alone is not the main issue when determining whether a component auditor may need to be involved. Given modern communication technology, it is geographic location that involves different laws and regulations, languages, cultures, and business practices that matters. And thirdly, the use of the term audit procedure causes practitioners and regulators to believe that the group engagement team is always specifying audit procedures in detail. To elevate this misconception, it might be better to use another term such as, for example, audit work. That's all, thanks.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks, Tom. On the on A, I support including more guidance there around the application of the risk-based approach, and thinking about the framework for the kind of stand-back activity. It feels as though it's almost certainly going to capture size and risk elements, which of course are the key elements on significant components. And so I think, given the fact that that kind of terminology in the practice is familiar to practitioners, I would just caution against moving so far away from sort of familiar territory that could cause application and practical difficulties of introducing new focus and new terminology. But I certainly feel that the framework is the right direction. And on the component auditor point, then absolutely, this is a very critical area of the standard. I think a couple of points that have perhaps not come up already was the point around if there is a local audit, and so the component auditor may not be the choice of the group auditor. And I think that plays into what Kai-Uwe just said about the competence of the team and looking at the capability of the group team as a whole. And finally, I would encourage looking back on component auditors to the kind of terminology in ISQM1 around network and non-networks to try and retain that neutrality, and again think of the capability that's needed for the audit rather than necessarily where the component auditor comes from. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Isabel.
Yes. Similar to Sachiko and Kai-Uwe, and as noted in paragraph 89 of the agenda paper, I still believe that the extant ISA 600 concept of significant component is a backstop for making sure that sufficient work is performed in a group audit, including the risk assessment procedures. Therefore, I believe that there is a risk that the removal of this concept does not encourage enough performance of full scope audit. And therefore, for me, there's a risk that the overall quality of the group audits is undermined. So that was for 3A, and I support the proposal of the task force for 3B. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. Len, in favor of the direction that the task force is taking for 3A and 3B, I think that the key concept in 3A, it's very relevant in terms of consistency in the application. I have to say that the elimination of the concept of significant component involves more time in scoping a group audit. I was a little bit frustrated because I ended up maybe spending double of what I usually do. And maybe it's because of the concept of risk assessment and going through each one of the accounts and then thinking about where the components are located and how big is the size of the accounts compared to materiality. I also noticed that I had to switch maybe full scope audits, or what we sometimes call in practice full scope audits, to specific scope audits. But then at the end, going back and taking 330 and thinking about, well, do I have sufficient evidence for all the materials accounts? You need to revisit the whole approach again to confirm that there's nothing really outside. So it was easier just with the concept of significant components, having a threshold, and then you put everything into a basket and then decide what you need to do for whatever is not covered. And that probably made me think that in practice, if it is not really applied in a consistent way, we're going to have a lot of issues really achieving the objective of the standard. So the direction on the framework and having that additional guidance on how to do the risk assessment with the 315 and the 330, it's going to be very important for all the teams. I think that the group audits where you have a large number or big number of components in locations around the world will struggle more compared to probably other groups with 30, 50 components, which is just going to be easier to do the scoping. Thanks.
Thank you. Imran?
Great, thank you. I noticed that Len had dropped off briefly there, but fortunately, Len, Dan, and Jasper were very much still on the call, so they haven't missed anything. On this point, I have sent some advanced comments, but I really want to react to what I've heard the board say. I think that there seems to be some enthusiasm still in our board for revisiting the concept of significant component in one form or another. I must confess that this is one area of the issues paper where it wasn't yet altogether clear to me what the firm task force proposals were, but at least to the extent that I understood the proposals, I didn't think that a reliance on a standback alone will address the significant component gap that had been highlighted to us by respondents, or that a framework was the solution. But I really qualify that based on what I understand for the moment. In respect of this section, I think that 76D, particularly the monitoring group member comment there, is a wonderful idea, and I strongly support it. I don't believe that the answer that we're looking for is in the approach that is presently being considered of referencing 315 and 220. Indeed, if that was the case, then wouldn't it stand to reason that 600 wouldn't be necessary for many other matters, simply because the answer to it could be found in 315 and 220? And I think that in truth, the proposals, if we think that the auditors using 315 will arrive at the correct significant components or equivalent matter, why not then find an appropriate way to be more explicit about this in ISA 600, please? Those are my comments on question 3. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just checking. Len, I assume you were just off for a brief moment, so I don't think it changes the tenor of the comments. I got a number of constructive comments. So the few that were sort of not supportive of the group's proposal, I think we're along the lines that we sort of want to see what the words are ultimately and how it's articulated, rather than an outright rejection of the direction of the task force. But I turn it back to you, Len, or Dan, or Jasper.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I probably miss what Sue and Isabel, and I came in at the tail end of Fernando's comments. So if other board members raise anything I might miss, maybe Jasper and Dan can respond on my behalf. But just hearing the comments, I just want to make sure maybe our issues paper is all clear. There was a lot of support in terms of doing away with the significant component definition in the ED 600. I think Kai Wu, you mentioned that one monitoring group member may raise a comment in that area. So that's on our work list. IAASB raised that comment, and the planning place to engage IAASB. I had spoke to a couple of IAASB members, and the view has been inconsistent. Some IAASB member actually support, just like other monitoring group member, IFIA members, that they support the task force positions. I think we heard a lot of comments in terms of that framework we talk about in terms of the financial significant concept. That's what we heard. We didn't hear a lot of people restating significant components. So I just want to make sure that's clear in terms of task force proposal to date. But just reflecting the comments that clearly that framework we talk about, tied to 315 to 220, that everyone had also raised, that some work needs to be we need to be doing. But also we appreciate the support in terms of using 315 and the stand back in paragraph 18 of 330 as part of the solution. And a couple comments on the responsibility of the component auditor. Sashiko, you raised that, and also Fiona, and we will take that back to think about responsibilities. And Julie, you clearly mentioned that in the X10 600 there wasn't a requirement to use component auditor. I think over the years, when you factor in the significant component concept, and as some of the practitioners default to a full scope audit, that involve component auditor. So in practice, people think there's a requirement to involve component auditor. I think we haven't really changed anything in the X10. It's optional. A lot of useful comments, I think, was consistent because 315 is not effective yet. So factoring people are making comments without having used 315 or maybe haven't had a chance to fully understand 315. That has been a challenge in terms of going through the comments we heard in the sections. And Chen Wei, I think I heard you about paragraph 90 in terms of the linkage to 220, paragraph 25. That's a good point because as you recall, leading up to the finalization of 220, there was a lot of work done in terms of that particular paragraph on resources, and also there's a lot of coordination between Q1 and 220 task force. So now we have that finalized paragraph 25 to 20. We can write special consideration for 600. So the task force noted that as well. I'm not sure if I missed other comments, particularly Sue, Isabel, and Fernando, maybe others, maybe Jasper and Dan, maybe you can address those.
Yeah, Len. So I think this general view, there are not that many different points that were raised in the part that you were still listening to. I think Sue had some good suggestions on the involvement of component auditors that we can take into account. Yeah, I think that's more in general. I think there were some were more in line of and Isabel was more in line with Sachiko and Kai Uwe, while Sue and Fernando, I think, were more in line with some of the others. That we still need, that the framework is important and that we further develop this approach. And I think from that perspective, really, when we have the wording, I think that will get more comments on this.
Okay, thank you, Jasper. So Tom, maybe we'll move to the next section.
Please go.
Okay. So make sure I'm on the right slide. So the next section is continue the theme of risk-based approach, more focusing on communications, paragraph 74 through 102. So for this section, just in summary, what we heard. There was a lot of support and agreement in terms of what's in ED. There are some specific comments on the wording of many of the requirements is more top-down in terms of communication from the group engagement team to the component auditors, rather than two-way. So we will probably need to make some changes. Additional clarity would be provided about the timing of the communication. People asking for more guidance. People also asking for additional clarity could be provided about the deliverables from the component auditors. And it is also unclear whether certain types of conclusion statements used in practice today could continue to be used in the revised CD 600. So the task force proposal include that taking consideration some of the comments or concerns on the clarity and appropriateness of the interaction between the group engagement team and the component auditors are related to comments from respondents on a risk-based approach. So the task force view is that the changes made to the risk-based approach will also help to address some of the specific comments related to question A, B in the exposure draft. There are a lot of good suggestions from respondents for other matters to include as required communications from component auditors. The task force will consider those suggestions, but we're seeking initial steer from the board members on whether to require component auditors to communicate corrected misstatements in addition to uncorrected misstatements of component financial information. So we'd like to some clarity and direction from the board on the corrected misstatement issue. So with that, Tom, I'll turn back to you and looking for comments from question 4 and 5.
Okay, feedback on questions 4 and 5. Fiona.
I was holding off thinking others might go first. Only one comment briefly on question 4. I just think we need to be careful around the flexibility around the conclusion. I think it is important to have consistency across groups, for example, or across firms, but maybe that's something that individual firms and networks need to work through. But a steer that we expect there to be some consistency would be helpful, and I do think it enhances audit quality as well. And then the second one, which I was going to make on question 5, I think it is just on paragraph 100. To your point, your question around communications of corrected misstatements, I do wonder that might be overly burdensome. There's a lot of groups that I have experience with where perhaps a component management and finance skills is lacking, and there seems to be a lot of corrections that need to be made. And is that really helpful or important in terms of communicating up to the group? And I do wonder that would be overly burdensome, if I could speak English, if you required all of those to be communicated. They're the only 2 comments I had. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you, Fiona. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. For question 4, as commented on 3B, I think clarifying the component auditor's responsibility may also help to, tone down the top-down nature of communication from group engagement team. And with regard to question 5, I'm okay to the proposal, but perhaps it may be a bit similar to what Fiona raised. But if it is to be included as a requirement, I think the purpose should also be clarified, because it may be a burden for the group engagement team with significant numbers of component auditors. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachika. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. Len, I do not have any further suggestions for question 4, and relating to question 5, I agree. But in my view, the threshold for reporting and misstatement should be set by the group engagement team. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Chun-Li?
Thank you, Tom. For number 4, I don't have any further suggestion as well. We'll be keen to see how the task force attempt to address this. 600 drives the work of the group auditor rather than the other way around. So I'm not sure to what extent we can help that, but keen to see what we come up with. For number 5, I see paragraph 100 where I think the decision earlier was the connection to deficiency in system of internal control, and therefore we did not feel the need for a requirement there. I think in practice, the connection is not always clear in jurisdiction where the financial reporting practice may be less matured, significant amount of misstatement may be identified and corrected through the audit process, but may not be seen as out of ordinary and therefore may not even be associated that clearly with an internal control weakness. We could make that explicit connection in the application material. I think that may be one potential solution. I feel that the requirement to communicate corrected misstatement may not actually be a bad idea. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Next is Julie.
Thank you. And Len, unfortunately, I didn't have further suggestions on your question 4, but Fiona's point around consistency, I think, is well taken. I think that would be important that those communications are, as you know, while maintaining principles based, they're consistent as possible to keep the quality the same. On question 5, I wasn't thinking this needed to be a requirement. I think that the reference to ISA 450 is valid, but I believe that documentation and accumulation of those misstatements would live in the component auditor's documentation. And, you know, if the group auditor was looking at that documentation, they would certainly be able to see that. But I hadn't gotten to the point, Len, that it needed to be communicated as a requirement. So, but, you know, Changwei, I just listened to your point around whether or not people made the connection between, you know, a lot of corrected misstatements and control deficiencies. That's fair, because I guess I was coming from the premise that control deficiencies would already be communicated and therefore this was sort of doubling up. But if you don't think that's maybe the connection everybody makes, then there might be value in investigating some sort of guidance on that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel.
Yes, thank you. So no real further suggestion on question 4. However, that's something we did not find, but of course we don't have the full picture right now, is what is the expected work effort on what is remaining as non-scoped accounts or components. So in extant ISA 600, we have a requirement to perform analytical procedures on the remaining financial information, but we were not sure in the new standard what was to be done on this remaining part for which nothing else would have been done. But it does not really answer to question 4. And regarding question 5, we raised the question to various practitioners, and it seems it's quite a common practice right now, at least in my jurisdiction. The uncorrected misstatements are requested, and group auditors see an advantage in that. But I'm not necessarily in favor of mandating it via a requirement. But at least it's something that is currently practiced for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Sue?
Thank you. I agree with others around consistency of communications for question 4. And I think also really encouraging a two-way communication, so that spirit of things going in both directions. Len and I think Fiona referenced the nature of the communications, and I think if there's anything that can be done around the areas of the kind of inter-firm reports that are issued at the moment, that would be helpful, and some clarity on the communication there, because that does drive the consistency. And on the question 5, possibly similar to Isabel, the feedback that I received was that people did not feel that this was a particularly burdensome request. So so comfortable with that proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Yash?
Thank you, Chair. Question 4. I am supporting the proposal of top-down communication as the way of group audit, because the ultimate responsibility for the group audit belongs to the group auditor, not component auditor. In addition, I would like the task force to consider prescribing more descriptions of the responsibilities and roles of a component auditor, I think. And question 5, I agree with the inclusion of the corrected misstatement into the component auditor's communication to group auditor, because corrected misstatement in one component could be information suggesting a misstatement of the whole group or of another component. And such communication could be information suggesting a deficiency of internal control over financial reporting, I think. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much. Roger?
Yes, supportive of the top-down approach, but I do like the idea of encouraging communication back. So getting the wording right of encouraging communication back on anything which may threaten the quality of the group financial statement. So just getting the wording around that. On question 5, I would be supportive of including it as a requirement. I could see it as additional information which may indicate something across the group, consistent with YOSH, or an internal control. I'm not weighed down by practical considerations, and so I wasn't seeing it as overburdensome, but I do realise that that would be a consideration that should be taken into account as to whether it's a requirement. But I would be in principle supporting of it as a requirement.
Thank you. Kai Morton?
Thank you. No specific suggestions on what you can do on 4. So, but similar to others, having the two-way communication, I think is emphasizing that is good. On 5, my feedback as well is that this is something that is done a lot today, but that there is a threshold in which misstatements that are communicated. If you were to communicate all the potential corrected misstatements on the components, it may be quite a lot. So there is some sort of threshold on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn?
On question 4, I agree with people on the two-way communication. I think that it's vital to stress and has been something that has been asked of us to consider. So that would be something I'd add there. In terms of question 5, one of our practitioners said that they did include corrected misstatements and it wasn't burdensome. However, I think the balance of opinion was, it's a good idea and I agree with that, but it shouldn't be mandated. People can do it if they want to, but at this stage it's not necessary to have it as a requirement. So that would be my position. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. On question 4, I don't have anything to add, any additional comments. On question 5, it's a good idea. It's a good recommendation, but I would not be in favor of having this as a requirement. Thanks.
Imran?
Thank you very much. In respect to questions 4 and 5, let me just refer to the underlying paragraphs. I think that there's a really good idea in paragraph 100, which supports and I support the point in the last sentence about communicating these corrected misstatement. I think it's fairly natural that the communication of such information can really only be valuable and not destructive to the quality of the audit. And I think we've heard about several ideas repeated by board members about how we can deal with practical challenges around it being burdensome through the introduction of some kind of threshold. But in most circumstances, I imagine that even the threshold is not going to be necessary. I think in paragraph 102, there is a really good idea, and I support the point that paragraph 44H of the exposure draft must be made clearer and broader, and that we simply do not agree that flexibility is a reasonable consideration here to stop our board from being a little bit more prescriptive as has been asked for by respondents. I think key to answering this question really is how the task force has framed question 4, in that the task force has thought about all 3 components of this communication: the nature, timing, and extent. I hear that a few other board members have said, well, they really don't have any other ideas. I think that the nature and timing is pretty well covered, but extent, and if we go back to comment letters, there are several comment letters which we can do in relation to extent. One of them is quoted in the issues paper and is quoted in 76D. I think it's a particularly good idea there about what can be done in relation to extent of this communication. I think that is captures the flavor of what people are looking for, or what some respondents are looking for in relation to further suggestions on communication between the parties. Naturally, therefore, I agree also with this proposal in question 5. So my answer there is a yes. Thank you.
Okay, Imran, we lost you for just a brief moment, but I think we were all able to get the gist of your comment, particularly as it relates to question 5, and you summarized your view at the end. So I think on 5, Len, you got broad support, but consistency and the two-way nature were key themes that I heard. I mean, on 4, you got consistency and two-way nature were the key themes. On 5, we got a little bit more diversity of viewpoint there. However, a few worried about the need to make it a requirement. Others suggested a threshold, and others I sort of said were supportive. I thought it could be good practice in my mind, and that in their jurisdictions, maybe it's been proven that it's not so burdensome. So that's a little bit of diversity that you have to think about there. I think one from a cost benefit analysis standpoint for you, but that's what I heard as it relates to 5. Like no one objected in principle to it, but there was some, as I view it, sort of cost benefit analysis being done among some of our board members on whether it's the burden is justified.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. I think you summarized both 4 and 5 very well, consistent with my notes. I think regarding 5, you know, the task force would like some clear steer in terms of where we're going, because you know, from my own count, it seems to be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. One third seems to be some practical challenge. 1/3 yes, the other third may be application material, some type of threshold. So I was wondering whether we're not deciding now, but can I, if you don't mind, maybe just a straw poll. I just want to make sure I get the numbers correct.
Okay, so I think the way to think about it is should there be a requirement of some sort along this line, right, Len? Now, whether it with a threshold or without a threshold is another subset of it, or some additional guidance. But for those who are sort of supportive of a requirement along the lines, as I said, we could caveat it afterwards.
Right.
At least explore that. Could you raise your digital hands for it?
So do you mind repeating what the proposal is, please, or how you've summarized it?
So, Len, the task force has suggested some, and maybe I'll leave it to Len, as a requirement to, Len, do you want to?
Yeah. I guess a requirement to include corrected misstatements as a requirement. The second option is it shouldn't be a requirement, but maybe you know, application material is a good practice. It's being done, so maybe we can rather than as a requirement, but have something in the application material. The third one is about threshold. Whether requirement is a threshold, but maybe it's just to make sure. Maybe Dan and Jasper can also come in as well. Was that the right summary in terms of 3 different options?
Well, actually, I think it's really important to separate. Like, 1 and 3 are part of the same proposal, and
right.
I think you could draft the requirement in such a way that you could, to some extent, limit the scope of the requirement or create it. But I guess there sort of is a fundamental choice: is do we want a requirement for this or not? And I guess I need to understand. Maybe everyone put their hands down, because this may be a clearer way to ask it.
Right.
Who does not support a requirement? Does not support a requirement along the lines that Len is proposing. So I have Lynn, Fernando, Julie, Fiona, who does not. Okay. Anyone? So by saying that, is other people support a requirement in some form? Now, hands down, here's the next way I'm going to try to limit the gets it clearest here. Who supports a requirement with some guidance, either specific or advice about application material regarding some form of threshold on this? So we have 11 board members right now who are stating that. But the idea is that at least people want to explore the idea of a requirement with some threshold associated for it. Okay, is everyone clear with what guidance we've given? Len and Jasper and Dan, I don't know if you have a response to that.
Yeah, I think that's a clear indication. A requirement with some consideration of threshold and application material. So we can explore that, and we'll discuss that at the task force meeting, and come back with wording and proposal.
Right. Nothing. Obviously, this is all to be reviewed again at our March meeting. Now I see Kai and Imran's hands up. Is that just inertia from the vote? Kai, okay, great. I think that was clear guidance. I was told by one of the staff that it was clear to him, so that's good. Should we go on to the final round of questions?
Yep, that'd be great. Move forward one more slide. So the last one is about linkage to ISO 220 and other standards, also the definition of the engagement team. So for this section, when we went out with the ED, ISO 220 was now finalized. So the respondent noted that the new definition of engagement team could lead to practical challenges. For example, compliance with the dependence rule and other ethical requirements. And also, now you're part of the engagement team. Everybody's in part of the engagement team. Practical challenges on direction supervision review of the component auditors. And also, definition could lead to legal and regulatory ramifications. Also, increased selection of component auditors from the group engagement team's own network. There was some anti-competitive indication in some of the comment letters. But respondent provided little suggestions on how to address the matters identified. So the task force spent a lot of time going through the comments, and here's our initial proposals. So we recognize we just approved ISO 220 with the engagement team definition in September. The task force is of the view that we noted the concern expressed but we do not warrant making changes to the definition in ISO 220. The possible solutions to the issues identified should be addressed through non-authoritative guidance in ED 600. So we are considering maybe, for example, compliance with independence and ethical requirement, maybe work with IAASB. There's an ongoing coordination going on with IAASB, their working group. Perhaps adding application material to 600 to better explain the direction, supervision, and review of the component auditors and the consideration of their competence and capabilities. And also develop additional implementation material addressing the practical challenges on the DSRs of the component auditors, especially from non-network firms, and also considering their competence and capabilities. And lastly, a change to one of the definition in the X10 600, also the ED 600, is the term group engagement team. We feel that having reference to two engagement teams seems to be causing a lot of confusion. And in practice, we've been calling group auditor rather than group engagement team. We use the term component auditor. We never use the word component engagement team. So in the issues paper, you see a diagram and also proposed change, doing away with the group engagement team expression, the term, and replace that with a group auditor to eliminate or reduce the confusion of having two different definitions on engagement team. So that's a task force proposal. So with that, I'll turn back to you, Tom, for comments.
Thank you. So on question 6, Fiona, no one's going to beat you this time.
I'm happy for you to mix it up and go to someone else first. So I really like the change from group engagement team to group auditor, so very supportive of that. In the bubble diagram, I can see the group auditor as a circle, and then you've got the green sort of dark crayons around the edge, those bubbles. And for there, I'm just wondering if your intention was to imply, when you look at that graphic, you have the group auditor and then you've got individual component teams. Are you implying that there are more teams that aren't component auditors that are part of that? I'm just wondering if that's what you were intending to do, or whether a pie chart would be better where you've got, it makes up the full pie to make up the full group. I just wasn't sure what the intention was. But other than that, no comments, supportive.
Okay, thank you. Kaiwa?
Thank you, Tom. Len, I also have a comment to paragraph 112, the first bullet. There I have a question. Has the task force considered the issue of the legal and regulatory ramifications of the new definition of engagement team? And if so, what is its proposed way forward on this matter? This is my question. No further comments. Thanks.
Okay. Imran?
Thank you. I think that, like Fiona, the suggestion made in this question 6 is a really good idea. I like it. I think it solves for us a few problems, and it is simple to understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Julie?
Thank you. And Len, I do think it's important, and there were a number of comment letters that urged the task force to continue the work with the IAASB group on getting alignment on the terms between the code and ISO 600. So I'm sure that's on your priority list, but it would be something that I would hope is continuing there, as you noted in the issues paper. I guess I was more leaning towards keeping the term group engagement team, but I don't have such a strong opinion that it couldn't be group auditor. Maybe I'm just used to the term group engagement team now, and it's sort of cemented in my brain, and I'm okay with it, but no strong view one way or the other. Thanks.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, Len, I think group auditor much preferable to group engagement team. So group engagement team just seems to be an all-embracing term. So group auditor, and I realise this will be an outlier consideration, but I would even look at network auditor. I know you've got to work with IAASB on those areas. I think we're trying to pick up network. I realise that's contentious because network has its own definitional problems as well. So I'd encourage you to work with it, but your alternative is much more preferable to the current situation.
Okay. I don't see any other hands. Anyone else like to come in? Lynn? Lynn?
Yep. Yeah, I just wanted to add my support to where the task force is, what that task force is proposing. I am a bit ambivalent between group engagement team and group auditor, but could certainly live with group auditor. And I did like the diagram, but now listening to Fiona, yeah, it is ambiguous about what the blue bit is. And so I like the concept, but maybe it needs a wee bit of reconstruction. Thanks.
Chun-Li? You're on mute.
Sorry. Just want to come in to add my support to group auditor. I think group engagement team is a term that all of us in this virtual room are familiar with, and therefore we don't see any issue with it. But I guess just looking at it from the outside, I can see why it's causing confusion. So I think group auditor will be a good solution. Just want to add my support.
Okay. I see no other hands. Got either support or non-objection for the general direction. You got a couple of questions seeking clarification. I think one from Fiona, one from Kai. So I'll turn it back to you, Len, to respond.
Yeah. Fiona and Lynn, on the diagram, you know, the intention is, you know, everybody's in one happy family engagement team. So maybe we could you know, present it a little bit differently to capture that. Kai, the legal ramification on the engagement team definition. I was on also Josephine. We were both on the ISA 220 task force. As far as I know, there was never any comments. Legal ramification comments raised in the 220 exposure process. So so we heard that in 600, but the task force haven't had a chance to discuss in terms of how to address those. But I guess we need to put on the agenda. But you know, clearly our intention is not going to change that definition. But at the same time, we didn't hear anything in the 220 exposure period on the legal ramification, the litigious environment in different jurisdictions. But we probably need to do some work, whether additional application material needs to be developed. But task force hasn't had a chance to discuss that. But other than that, I think the support for the group auditor, and we appreciate that. And I think we heard it enough for this section. Also, other 5 questions we posted today. So Tom, I think the task force have enough to go on for our next task force meeting.
Okay, I see Billy's hand up, and of course, before we go, the only other thing is that we're going to just ask anyone else if there's anything else in the questions that were presented today that board members wish to raise too before closing as well. Willie, do you have something you'd like to add?
Yes, just adding on to what Lena said in terms of the definition of engagement team. I think we need to remember that ISO 600 is not the standard that changed the engagement team definition. That was done in 220. 220 considered, went through the due process and considered the comments we received. That standard was approved in September. So there's certainly no way that the group audit task force can now consider changing the definition of engagement team. We must also keep in mind that we are working very closely, and I know specifically at staff level between Jasper and Carla from the ethics board. They're undertaking the separate project on the group engagement team definition and independence considerations in that regard. And they are fully committed at the moment to adopt exactly the definition we have, so that the definition is completely aligned between the ISAs and the code. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Billy. Len, we're not quite done yet.
No, we're not.
Put it back to you.
Yeah, moving forward to the next slide. So just go back to the heat map. So we haven't touched on other issues we heard from the common letter process. So this just give you a bird's eye view of those issues that we haven't talked about today. As you can see, that still 3 area needs a lot of considerations. The acceptance, continuance, documentation, those also link to access to information as well. And other matters, for example, linkage to other standards such as going concern, fraud, and subsequent event. But next slide, please. Next, yeah. So just give you an overview of in terms of what we heard in other areas. Clearly, as you all know, that the ITC started out as 600 and the QM project is 1. So there was comments about the linkage between 600, 220, ISQM1, and also the risk-based approach we just talked about today in terms of that as a group of standards, how to implement together. There's also support for the overall structure and the separation of the requirement for component auditor. We got a lot of good support in terms of scalability and professional skepticism. A lot of support building on the professional skepticism task force, also the language in ISO 220. Overall, people seems to be comfortable in terms of scalability. There might be some guidance needs to be addressed in terms of the larger, more complex group. But overall, people tend to be pretty happy about scalability. Acceptance, continuance, overall support, but a number of suggestions also need further enhancement, especially on the equity method investee. I think Chen Wei raised that earlier today. Next slide, please. Then there were a number of practical challenges raised in other areas: sufficient appropriate audit evidence, response to assess risk of material misstatements, statutory work. A lot of statutory works are done in conjunction to group audit. So people asking for some of the perhaps clarification and also a coordination between the statutory audit versus group audit. The 3 testing approach in ED 897, full scope audit versus certain audit procedures. Those testing approaches, we'll probably bring something back in future meetings. common control, centralized activity, those so didn't receive a lot of comments in those areas. A lot of support in terms of what we have in ED. Some guidance asking for in terms of a few definitions such as aggregation risk and component performance materiality. Overall support for documentation, but just like everything else, some clarity needed, especially on the component auditors definition to be included in the group auditors file. So all those are kind of preview in terms of coming through in future meetings in terms of some of the issues we're going to bring to the board for further input. So with that, turn back to you, Tom.
Okay, I guess I'd invite any general comments of what they just heard, or any issues that people would like to raise, or questions you'd like to raise on topics that were not specifically addressed to the questions earlier. Any hands, any comments? Len, I think you guys have done such a great job that people are just nodding their heads, are supportive. In fact, I guess I'm not used to generally seeing so much strong support, broad support, overall support in response to ED. So that must be your task force and staff's expert job in creating ED 600.
Yeah, well, thank you to the board for their patience, because 600 touches on a number of standards which are not subject to revision, but I think the QM task force, the 3QM project, and also 315 provided a lot of good work for us, build the foundation for us. So I think the credit goes to the 3 QM projects and also ISA 315. And clearly my task force are amazing. So I want to make sure people know my task force is amazing. Thank you.
I like building streaks, and we know the proof will be in the pudding when we start doing all the drafting that comes next, and see if we can maintain this momentum. Jim Galkett had to depart to teach a class, but I asked if he had any comments, and he said he had not. Some of that may be because the CAG itself has not had the benefit of reviewing the comment letter analysis yet. So I assume that will occur as we meet with them in March. Karen, I don't know if you'd like to add anything before we bring this session to a close.
The only thing I'd say is thanks for bearing with me with my technology issues. I found I had to take the camera off to make sure I didn't lose the connection. But I found the conversation very robust and thoughtful and thorough. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. I could empathize on technology issues, even my internet. I think in the whole year that we've run virtual meetings, this was the first time that my internet connection went out during our Zoom session even for a minute, caused a brief panic. So thank you for joining us as well, and for your observations. Okay, anyone else like to say anything on 600? So tomorrow we're dealing with EER. Lynn, I don't know if you'd like to say anything to, as I call it, the coming attractions for tomorrow, but if you would like to, we have a couple minutes.
Thank you for that opportunity, Tom. We'll just be working through tomorrow the guidance and supplement B, and I intend to take a very similar approach to what we did at the last meeting, big chunks of the guidance. We also, since the papers were posted, have had a PAT meeting, so I will be providing an update on what the project advisory panel has told us. But other than that, look forward to your comments, and just remember we're working towards approval of getting this material out by March. And I have to say, all of the feedback we're getting at present is stop playing with it, get it out. So if people can start with that thought in their heads, that would be useful. Thanks, Tom.
So you're emphasizing the 80-20 rule for us tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, from an administrative front, tomorrow we probably have the better picture. We have the TAs going to be photographed on Zoom. I clearly corrupted the board picture today. I'm sorry I had to be part of that for you guys. Probably my absence would have made it better. But thank you all for a great meeting today. Thank you really to the task force and the staff for really clearly articulated issues paper, which facilitated such a good conversation. And I think everyone participated today. So that's also a great sign for the board. And I think Karen highlighted sort of that a little bit in her observations of the meeting. So I wish you all, for those who are, it's still night or ready to sleep, have a good night. For those who are sort of just beginning the day, have a great start to the day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.